Good afternoon, everybody. It feels like a Monday to me, but it's not, of course. It's because I've just returned from sunny Portugal to do my music. And I'm going to be joined in a minute by Len from the Ukrainians. We're going to talk about his life in music and also the new single, which is raising money, much needed, and awareness as much as anything else, which is still needed, unbelievably. But first, let's have this.
I need to get going, Mel. See you later.
Len, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're very welcome.
And of course, from the Ukrainians. Now, Len, before we start and go back, if you like, to your life in music, let's just talk for a minute about the atrocity that's happening out in Ukraine at the moment.
Yeah.
It, like all of these things, unfortunately, when things like this first happen, you find that, you know, the world turns its attention to what's going on, and people are, you know, people are focused and they want to help, etc. But as the longer these things go on, you find that people's attention seem to wane and almost go elsewhere, and kind of, I hate to say forget, but they kind of forget that things are going on. Do you feel that way in a way?
Yes, I do, and I think. Well, I was going to say the fault, but it's not the fault of people generally. I think it's just the way the media work, and probably has to work in a way, because there are lots of stories to tell. There are lots of news items, you know, constantly new things happening, new disasters and whatever. And so most of the coverage will necessarily have to be when those things first happen. And but of course, you know, these things continue well after the items have dropped down the priority list on the news. And we could even say the same about COVID. You know, I mean, COVID is still going on. I mean, clearly it's not as bad as it was, but it's kind of fallen off the list of priorities on the news, isn't it? And especially when you've got someone like Boris Johnson, who is very newsworthy, let's say. But you're right. You know, in Ukraine, it's all still going on. You know, there are people with nowhere to live that have been displaced, that are leaving the country.
Yep.
That don't have the food and the medical supplies and the clothes and other things that they need just to lead a normal human existence. And so the pressure needs to keep being put on so that monies can be diverted, you know, to them.
Yeah, exactly. And that is why people are still going to continue to do things like yourselves in order to continue to raise that awareness, or bring that awareness back around again, and refocus people's minds again, which is absolutely necessary. So thank you to begin with for doing that. Tell me a little bit about yourself, sir. Where did music start with you? When did you first start getting into music?
Oh, personally, not just the Ukrainians.
No, not just.
Okay. Way back in the midst of time. I think we're going back into the early 80s, and I lived up in Leeds at the time. There wasn't very much in the way of jobs and employment, so and I'd always liked music, so I picked up a guitar, cheap 30 quid Woolworths guitar, started to teach myself a bit of music. There were lots of fanzines around at the time. It was very politicised up in Leeds because it was the era of Margaret Thatcher, and so things weren't very rosy. up north, and started to record my own tracks at home and write songs at home. And there seemed to be quite a lot of people doing a similar thing, doing stuff in their own bedrooms, and there came to be an underground scene, fueled by fanzines and cassettes and so on, where people were doing a kind of minimalist, very often synth-based, lo-fi kind of thing in their bedrooms, which there is a term for, which I can't quite remember now, but that kind of thing is really popular in Germany, or was very popular in Germany, and still is, actually.
Yeah,
there's still a lot of
DIY scene.
Yeah, the DIY thing. Yeah, and
can you? Are you on your phone, by the way? Can you just try and move it a second, because we're getting a little bit of crackle,
okay.
etc.
I'm on the iPad.
Oh, on your iPad.
Is it still there?
It's still there a little bit. Yeah, it's almost like interference on the telephone line, but I don't know whether just moving.
Oh, right. Is it audio interference, not
yes,
video?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Right. Let me take my phone away in case that's it.
There we go.
Does it sound like a freezer?
Well,
because I'm in the kitchen and there's a freezer in the kitchen, but it's not that loud. But maybe if it's if the mic's compressed, it's compressing the sound.
Oh, it sounds like you got on the line. That's what it sounds like.
But, right. No idea in that case. Is it still happening?
Yeah. Let me just try this a second. Let's see if it's still there. Hello.
Hi. Yeah.
Yeah. It's still there, but don't worry. We'll carry on. We're pros. We'll see what we can do.
Yeah. Okay. It's not. It's not really off-putting, is it? Or annoying?
No, it's fine. In terms of then the sort of thing you were listening to.
Yeah.
When you first started buying music, etc. What was that?
Right. Nothing like the music I was making, because I thought, as did a lot of people at the time, that there weren't really that many people making a similar thing to me. Like I say, there was the odd fanzine and cassette that was stuck to the front cover that would feature some kind of homemade DIY stuff, but I still thought it was a fairly rare thing. But it turns out that it wasn't. I mean, in later years, lots of this stuff came to light, and people have taken more an interest in it. Like I say, especially in other parts of Europe and Germany and so on. I digress. What were we?
So what were you listening to?
Oh yes, yeah. Well, I was probably listening to. Oh dear. Well, what was going on in the other part of the country? Where while people were suffering and starving and not having jobs in the north, down in the south, it seemed to us like everybody was making money on the money markets and waving wads of cash. And the music, the kind of pop music at the time, mainstream stuff, seemed to mirror that. So you had your Duran Durans going off on, speedboats and to the Bahamas or whatever, and that was a completely opposite thing to my experience. But that was what I was hearing. I wouldn't say I was necessarily listening to it.
Yeah.
I did like things like early Human League. When the Human League was actually experimental and interesting and a bit off the wall, not when they got all poppy with the Dare album and so on, but pre that. And Peel was playing lots of interesting stuff at the time, so that was the place to go to hear anything that wasn't bland and poppy. I used to listen to Peel at that time, and used to enjoy it. I'm struggling to pick out names of bands now that I can remember, but I was very involved in the Leeds scene in the 80s, and there were loads of bands like the Three Johns and the Mekons, Soft Cell, all that a bit later. And I used to like all of those.
Yeah. If it hadn't been for Peel, I don't think a lot of people would have expanded their music listening as much as they would have done.
No,
I think for lots of us, Peel was the door opener to, the weird and the wonderful, and sometimes it was exactly that. It was extremely, extremely sort of left center and a little bit difficult, but it was there, and he challenged us all with our listening, which was great, and he was stubborn about it as well, which I think. Which made him different in terms of a presenter. Do you think there's anyone out there today that's actually picking up the baton of Peel and helping people listen? I mean, I think Tim Burgess is doing quite a good job. Next to the Charlatans with his listening party, etc. But
I suppose so. Yeah, I mean, my radio listening these days tends to be Six music. I suppose I don't really tend to go search much further than that, but to me Six music seems to be DJ'd by a lot of people that have kind of picked up Peel's baton, really. So you do hear a lot of new stuff on Six music, and you hear a lot of stuff that's kind of out there and definitely wouldn't make it in the mainstream. So Peel's kind of alive and well, I think, in that sense. He's got his son as well, Tom Ravenscroft, doing stuff. But your Gideon Coath and your Mark Rileys, and they're all kind of keeping the Peel spirit alive, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think he does live on through some of his contemporaries that are out there, which is a good thing. So let's jump forward a little bit. When you then started making music yourself, did you have a way of making music particularly, or was it
in the early days? I had a Wasp synthesizer and a Soundmaster drum machine, which just had a bass and a snare and a hi-hat and a cymbal on it. It was all very simple in those days, and I had a jig guitar, and I used to borrow somebody's 4-track tape machine, so I'd have a vocal, a guitar, a synth, and a drum machine, and just write stuff straight to that and mix it and so on.
I miss those 4-track tape recorders.
Well, yeah.
You can still get them. You can still get them.
Yeah, well, I mean, they were great because you had to focus what you were doing. And so, I would do an EP in a weekend because, I used to put stuff out on vinyl. I used to do 4-track vinyl EPs during the 80s and 90s. And because I didn't have and couldn't record something to record it on myself and couldn't afford really to go into a studio, there was a guy who I used to know, a guy called Tony Baker from a band called Household Name in Leeds. Yeah. And I'd say to him, Tony, can I borrow your 4-track for a weekend? And I'd set myself that weekend to write from scratch 4 tracks. I never used to really write songs as such on the guitar. I just kind of worked from the drum machine upwards, drum machine, bass, guitar, and then stick some vocals over the top. And I had no idea at the beginning what it was going to be like at the end. But that was the early stuff. And then a friend of mine knew someone who was going to set up a recording studio in Leeds city centre. And we must be talking 1981, 82, something like that. And so I went into partnership with him, and we set up an 8-track studio in Leeds city centre. And we did that I was part of that for about 18 months. The studio went on afterwards, but I left after 18 months, let's say. It's a complicated story and far too depressing and complicated to go into here. But in that 18 months, we recorded. Crikey, it was unbelievable because we were just charging £5 an hour.
Right.
So everybody came to us because it was undercutting the other studios massively.
Yeah.
So I think we had in the first 18 months, I think we had about 300 bands and artists through from Leeds, Bradford, Huddersfield, Wakefield.
And you said it was 8-track, but what was the actual technology itself? Was that?
It was reel to reel. It was a reel to
reel.
reel. Yeah. So it was 1-inch reel to reel tape, and then we with 8 tracks on, and then we mastered that onto 1/4-inch stereo tape. So razor blades for editing and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Great British string.
I actually bought myself one of the first ever 8-track normal cassette 8-tracks.
Ah, right.
Yeah, I know. I had some money back then, but it was. I mean, it was so much fun. It was so much fun, and as you say, there was something about the fact that it was still very physical, the technology back then. I've just found that there were so many people just wanting to get in and record, and people were just trying to record really quickly as well. It almost came to the table with an album, and then just wanted to get it out there. I've just finished reading Paul Whitelaw's book about the first few albums of Bell and Sebastian, their little journey into music, etc. And the first album, Tiger Milk, in and out in a week. How many bands do an album in and out in a week these days?
Yeah. Well, the temptation these days, I think, is to, I'm going to sound like an old bloke now, which I am, it's to say, well, in the old days, we only had this. But the thing is, you can make fantastic tracks these days because you have endless infinite number of tracks you can use. And, the kind of effects and God knows what you can use. You could end up twiddling with one piece of music for a lifetime if you really wanted to. Whereas in that time, in the 80s, there was only so much you could do, and so it had to be quick. There was no other way of, there was nothing to do with any extra time you might throw at it.
Yeah. And there was something it produced. Some amazing albums out of that, I think. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. I mean, even the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper was recorded on 2 4-tracks, which is, if you listen to that loud, it's quite extraordinary to think that could possibly have been the case. Loads of tracks, and you think there should be loads of hiss and things not right all over it, but it just sounds magnificent, really.
Yeah. So how? Tell me about the Ukrainians. How did that all come together?
Right. Okay. Well, a little band called The Wedding Present. In the 1980s, for those that are not aware, there were a much loved by John Peel indie guitar band that hailed from Leeds.
Ended up on Cooking Vinyl, I think. Is that right?
They did. Well, I think they did do a couple of things on Cooking Vinyl at one point. Yeah. I mean, they started off on their own label, which was Reception Records, and then they got signed up by BMG, which was the first major label that they were signed to. And that's kind of where I came in because the Wedding Present had a John Peel session to do. I think it was about their 4th John Peel session. And they'd actually run out of songs. They didn't have any English songs left. And they didn't know what to do. So Pete, who I'm in the Ukrainians with, and who was the Wedding Present guitarist at that time, suggested, well, my dad is Ukrainian, and I know a few Ukrainian tunes. Why don't we do some Ukrainian tunes? So the guy thought, well, there's nothing else we can do. So they decided to go for it, and Pete suggested that I join them because Pete knew of me because he was. We knew, it's part of a fairly small scene, I suppose. So
a bit like an extended family.
Yeah, and Pete knew that that I liked all kind of things Eastern European, and that I studied Slavonic languages at uni, and that I played a bit of scratchy fiddle, and he didn't realise how scratchy it was till I joined. But anyway, and we did the sessions. We did the session, the John Peel session, and it went out, and I think the guys just thought, well, this is probably gonna get a bit of a strange reaction. In fact, it probably won't get any reaction at all. Anyway, the complete opposite happened, and people loved it. And Peel, I think he repeated it about 5 times.
Wow.
And about 3 months later, we got a phone call from him saying, I'd really like you to do another one. So we did another one. So trying to.
It's a great story, that.
Yeah, it was good, and so I kind of went along for the ride for that, and in the end we did 3 Ukrainian sessions for John Peel. The first 2 were released as a 10-inch vinyl, which sold about 75,000 copies, I think. It got in the top 25 of the actual album chart, not the indie chart. And that was the first release for the wedding present on BMG as well. So that was all a big surprise. And we were going to record an album of our own songs that Pete and myself were writing as the wedding present.
Right.
But that never happened because the other guys were getting a bit scared that the identity of the wedding present might start getting a bit confusing. If people didn't know whether an album was going to come out with folk instruments in Ukrainian or indie guitars in English.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
And so I totally understand that. So Pete was more interested in doing the Ukrainian stuff, and we ended up kind of breaking off and forming the Ukrainians. That would have been in 1991. Which is the same year that Ukraine got its independence from the Soviet Union. So it's quite a good time to do it.
Yeah.
And so we started, we got a deal, 3-album deal with Cooking Vinyl Records in London. And we, made a single that got an NME Single of the Week, and then recorded an album, and it just kept on growing from there, really.
And it was a great time for music as well. Again, there was a real resurgence of, at the time, I was in a band at the time, and, all of the independent labels were really big. 4AD was really big at that time. And, there was a whole, there was a whole very creative independent scene. It was.
Yeah, definitely. When people could just do their own thing instead of, being, let's say, guided by the majors into doing, formulaic, bland stuff. Yeah.
Well, I think it confused the hell out of certain industry people at the time, because people, were trying to pigeonhole you and see where you fitted, and it was like, what are you? Well, we're kind of indie rock folk, a bit of world, and what? Where do we put you on the shelf?
Exactly. Yeah. And when people are creative in music, then things aren't, new things are not going to fit neatly into pigeonholes, are they? And that was the whole thing, with the whole world music thing and so on. There's lots of hybridization going on, and we kind of suffered from that as well. When we first started, people didn't know, wouldn't put us on at a rock festival, and they wouldn't put us on at a folk festival because we were too indie, and they wouldn't put us on at an indie festival because we were too folky, and and we'd find ourselves falling between the stalls a bit. But then after about a year or two, we started getting invited to all of them.
Yeah,
So,
wasn't it about that sort of time that even people like Peter Gabriel's Real World label took off?
Yeah.
It was that kind of time, wasn't it?
It was,
yeah.
There was a whole thing about world music was becoming a thing, and I remember when we were playing down at the, we were playing quite often down at the Marquee, and I remember the Pogues were doing a similar thing at the time. And I remember reading in later years, although this was never said at the time, that I remember Shane McGowan saying somewhere that they were fretting a bit about the idea of using all these acoustic instruments and doing a kind of punky Irish thing. And then he said, I wish I could remember where it was I read it, that we then stumbled on this band called the Ukrainians that were doing a similar thing to us, but in Ukrainian, and so they felt kind of that it was
Why
okay.
not?
Weren't alone in doing it, and I can understand that anxiety. But yeah, it was.
Well, that's nice to feel like you've inspired the Pogues a bit.
Well, I don't know. I don't know whether we inspired them as such. I'm sure Shane was well inspired himself, but
he was certainly yeah.
Yeah, but you know what I mean. It was hearing that years later was kind of interesting thing to hear, because we were full of doubts at the time about whether we were just doing something completely ridiculous or whether we were doing something.
But even in the pop world, because everything that happens in the more left of centre world sort of spills over into pop. I don't know whether you remember, but also at that time you had the likes of Gloria Estefan, and you had the beginnings of people beginning to produce pop music in their own language as opposed to English. It wasn't, there was definitely that kind of move towards it was okay to sing in Spanish or Latin American. It was fine.
Yeah, because in the Brits and the Americans notoriously are very resistant to music in other languages. Still are, to a great extent, not quite so bad as they used to be, but it's
it's always a shame. I mean, I've just come back from a holiday in Portugal. Whenever I'm in a different country, I always like to tune into what's going on in their charts just to see, because you always get the obvious. You get there's Ed Sheeran, there's a bit of Harry Styles, and then you'll get the Portuguese artists or whatever that will sit there in the middle of the charts or whatever. But it's I'd love to try and collect those things when I'm abroad and bring them back.
Yeah. And the thing is that in other parts of Europe, the language thing isn't quite so important. You'll get a lot more German bands will be listened to in France and Spain and so on, and Spanish bands in Italy and Greece, and it's just a bit annoying that in Britain we've got this insular kind of island mentality that which it informs
or we're just basically lazy and we can't be bothered to learn other people's languages.
It's all part of that, and it's all part of the Britain is great, everybody else are foreigners kind of thing that still is there's too much of around, and you can see it in the way people think politically these days in Britain still, and it's sad, but and the fact that we've come out of Europe is all part of that, because people don't want to be in it because they can't be bothered learning other languages, and they think we're superior to people in other countries in Europe and around the world. It's that whole Anyway, I'm warbling on now. But
it's absolutely fine. Now, listen, I had a young Ukrainian artist on not so long ago, and it was fascinating because one of the things that she was doing was she'd been going around collecting more traditional Ukrainian songs because a lot of them had been wiped out, if you like, by occupation. Or sanitized, shall we say, not necessarily completely wiped out, but sanitized in terms of the stories and the language, but by occupation. But what she was doing was trying to get recordings of old babushkas to pull these back. Have you had similar experience? Have you tried to sort of?
Yeah, we have. Especially in the early days, because. I should say there are kind of three strings to our bow, if you like. One is singing and playing, recording traditional Ukrainian songs that we find, and there are thousands and thousands of them. And we write our own songs that are musically in the kind of folk tradition. We play them in a kind of folk tradition, and then we do cover versions of kind of classic British and American rock songs, as if they were folk songs.
Right.
But the first group of those, the traditional folk songs, Ukrainian folk songs, when we first started looking for them, the places where you'd find them the most would be on old Melodia label records that were made in the Soviet Union.
Yep.
And what Melodia used to try and do was to make everything sound classical. So you'd have a song that would have been passed down the generations, round the campfire in a village in Ukraine. Was being played by trained classical singers and musicians in a big studio with massive orchestras, and it's not right.
No, yeah.
And so very often, we could only find versions like that. But then we were helped a lot by people at the Bradford Ukrainian Club, who had cassette recordings and old recordings of some songs, done in a much more simple, natural style, and they would make us cassettes of those, and we used to kind of cherry pick some of the songs off those they gave us.
Yeah.
And so that was really good. But now, of course, with the internet, it's much as long as there are people there still alive, there still are old folks that will still know the songs of various folk songs. And of course, in different parts of the country, there are different types of folk songs, or they might even be the same folk song, but with different words or slightly different verses or whatever. So there's quite a lot there to
have some kind of dialectic change to it or whatever, which is quite important. The way that something evolves from one place to another and how the story moves is quite important.
Yeah, it's all part of the story. But when people are out there trying to save songs and record them for posterity, and like you say, you've spoken to someone recently that's doing exactly the same thing. And there are so many to save, I can go over to Ukraine and there are books on the bookshelves now with hundreds and hundreds of folk tunes in, but there are thousands and thousands, but we're not going to end up recording them all.
No, so someone else has to take up the mantle as well.
Leave some for somebody else. Yeah.
So talk to me about the single that you've just done. And how did you get Wobble involved? Because obviously,
that was.
He's a character.
He certainly is. There's no mistake about that. He's a lovely guy actually, and there are stories about him, of course, and that he wouldn't deny from back in the day, in the 70s and the 80s. But he seems to have. Well, he pretty much says that he's become more Buddhist-like, really, and he's very kind of relaxed and philosophical about things. He's got a good attitude. And so it was like a lot of music things. It was by accident. The Ukrainians used to rehearse in a place in Holbeck in Leeds called Old Chapel Studios, and there was a guy there that ran it called Mark Hubbard, and Mark went on to become Jar Wobble's bass tech.
Yep.
Which I didn't know until because I'd lost contact with Mark for a year or two, and in that time he'd done that, and when the invasion happened, apparently Mark had a conversation with John, aka Jar Wobble, and said, "Look, I know these guys called the Ukrainians. Why don't you do something together to try and raise some money for the refugees?" So I got a call from. John thought that would be a grand idea, and Mark put us in touch, and I met up with John at one of their gigs at the Chelsea Arts Club, which is a rather swish venue, I must say.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely fabulous club. And anyway, me and John kind of hatched the plot after the gig. And to do the national anthem, and then I went back home and recorded a few files and things with the other guys, and we sent in the files, and John Klein was also involved. He used to be, I think he was the last guitarist with Susie and the Banshees.
Right.
And he was involved in putting the track. He played guitar and put some and mixed it, I think. Whereas John put on his bass and did the dubby things and effects and so on. And myself and the rest of the Ukrainians did the vocals and sent in the vocals. So it was
it a surprise when you heard it back?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very aware of Jar Wobble and his oeuvre.
Yeah.
And I really like his stuff. But yeah, I didn't quite know how it was. I knew there was going to be a big dubby bass, but no, I was really.
It's a great bass line, though.
I do really like it. Yeah.
Yeah.
To the point where it would have been nice, to have done another track or two, but but I know John's busy doing his own new album at the moment, but it was great to do it, and then I went down and met John and John Klein, and we did a video down in Wimbledon one day, and it's still raising money, so cool. We're still encouraging people, like we were saying at the beginning of the interview. It's important to keep the money rolling in, and so
just tell people where the money's going.
Right. Okay. The money is going mostly to the DEC, which is the Disasters Emergency Committee Help Ukraine appeal, Ukraine humanitarian appeal. So it'll be going there, and that is specifically for food, medicines, clothing.
Yeah.
We have had a couple of people contact us, surprisingly, saying, "Well, we're not doing this because we don't want to fund arms and all that. This is not going to be funding arms. This is to help innocent people caught up who have lost their homes and don't have food and clothes and haven't got anywhere to go." not a penny of this is going to fund arms.
So it's always the case, isn't it? When it's a war effort, which is, someone makes the assumption that the money's going to prolong the war, but ultimately the war's going on, and it's the innocent that are suffering from it that need the help. Yeah, no, absolutely.
So if people do want to hear the track and to download it, or to make a donation, they can go to the Wobble Ukrainians Bandcamp site, and I can't remember the exact time.
We'll get the details, and we'll tag it onto this so that people can go and find it, because that's important. Do you know what? With all of the music that's been produced in terms of trying to raise awareness, trying to raise funds, etc., for this, I could see an album coming together.
That would be quite nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Get the Pink Floyd track on there as well.
Yeah, yeah. There have been quite a few tracks, and that's a really good idea. Somebody ought to try and join that.
If you're out there and if you're the right person to make that happen, can someone join the dots and make an album happen? Because I think, as much as anything else, it'd be really quite interesting to hear that as a collective album. And also that could accelerate the amount of money that's raised as well. So that would be
absolutely, globally it could make quite a difference.
So that would be brilliant. Len, thanks for coming to talk to me today.
You're welcome.
I hope you've not been overawed by the whole experience. So
no, that's great. No, I'm always up for new experiences. That's cool. Great. I appreciate you kind of inviting me along to chat. So that's much appreciated.
No, well, thank you. And if people do want to download the music, do donate. Obviously, don't just download it. How selfish would you be? Give as much as you can.
Yeah, I mean, to download the track doesn't cost a lot. I don't know what it is, but it's probably less than £1, isn't it? And and you can if you want to give more, then there's a link there.
Absolutely. So we'll put the link in so that people can do that. Do that, folks. And meanwhile, Len, thanks so much for joining me today. Thanks for talking about your music. It's been a pleasure finding out about it from you. Bye for now.
Take care. Thanks.
Bye-bye.